The day has done all it needs to do. Now only stillness remains. Let your thoughts loosen like threads unraveling in the dark. What comes next is not to solve or to chase, just a quiet story drifting close. Perhaps it's a voice that remembers you, or a silence that has waited patiently. Let it meet you where you are, and let it lead you gently into rest. The day had slipped away unnoticed, as if the sun had decided not to linger too long. In a quiet town nestled between hills and silence, the moon now floated high above the earth calm, watchful, casting a silver sheen over the forgotten parts of the world. And there, on the outskirts, the old graveyard waited like it always did, still, patient, wrapped in soft mist that clung low to the headstones. Eleanor Hartley walked slowly, her boots pressing gently into the damp earth. She didn't like to be out this late, but the letter had been insistent. No signature, no return address. Just a folded paper slipped beneath her door that morning, with a single line written in hurried, slanted ink. Come to your father's grave tonight. Her father had died nearly 20 years ago, buried under the crooked oak near the back of the cemetery. The town barely remembered him anymore, a drunk who had seen too much war, too many things he wouldn't speak of. But Eleanor remembered. She remembered the way he used to sit in the doorway, smoking in silence. How he'd once told her, half asleep and half sad, some debts follow you into the ground. She held a lantern in one hand, the warm light dancing across weather-worn names. The air felt thick, like it held its breath. As she walked deeper into the graveyard, a faint sound whispered across the stones. A shuffle, not loud, but just enough to make her stop. She turned. Nothing. Only the mist curling between the graves. Her heart ticked faster, but she pressed on, the light guiding her past rows of moss-covered headstones. She knew this path. She had walked it every year on the same date, placing Lily beside the crooked oak. But tonight felt different, as though the graveyard had been expecting her. When she reached her father's grave, she paused. The earth looked disturbed. The soil was darker, as if it had been recently touched, though there were no signs of digging. The flowers from last year were gone, not wilted, gone. She crouched down, brushing her fingers across the carved name, Martin Hartley. And that's when she heard it soft, like breath against her ear. A single word, Eleanor. She stood up too fast, nearly dropping the lantern. The flame inside danced wildly. She turned in a slow circle, her breath tight in her chest. Who's there? No answer. But the mist shifted. Not with the wind, there was no wind, but with presence. Something unseen brushing past. She took a step back, nearly stumbling into the iron fence that marked the cemetery's edge. Then another voice, this time behind her. You came. She turned sharply. A man stood beneath the oak, tall, wearing a coat that looked too old for anyone alive. His face half in shadow but unmistakably familiar, not just in features, but in the quiet way he held his shoulders. Her voice cracked. Dead? The figure didn't move, didn't answer. He only watched her, as if weighing whether to speak. I buried you here, she whispered. I saw them lower your coffin. He nodded once, not denying, not confirming, just acknowledging the memory. Then he spoke again, softer this time. You shouldn't have come alone. She stepped closer, the lantern shaking slightly in her hand. You wrote me the letter? No. Research. A pause. But I knew you'd come. Something rustled nearby. Not an animal. Not a breeze. It was heavier than that deliberate. Her eyes flicked toward the sound, but the mist was thick now, curling like fingers around her feet. When she looked back, the man was gone. In his place only the grave, untouched, silent, as though nothing had ever been there. Eleanor stood frozen, the lantern casting a trembling halo around her. Somewhere nearby, something exhaled. The graveyard didn't feel empty anymore. Eleanor didn't move for a long while. The mist curled around her ankles like water in a slow tide, and the lantern in her hand hissed softly with the sound of its own flame. She wasn't sure what she'd just seen or if she'd seen anything at all. But one thing was certain. She had heard his voice, clear, measured. Not a memory, not a dream. She forced herself to breathe one slow inhale at a time. Her fingers clenched the handle of the lantern, its metal warm from the heat inside. She backed away from her father's grave, the name still etched clear in her mind, Martin Hartley. She didn't dare turn her back on it. Not yet. Not while the image of that figure lingered behind her eyes. Only when the iron gate to the cemetery came into view did she finally spin around and begin to walk fast, but not running. Running felt like something you did when a predator was sure to chase. This felt different. Not a threat exactly, but a presence. She made it to the main road, her boots clicking now on the asphalt. The graveyard stretched behind her like a shadow with no source. The mist didn't follow. It just sat there, gathered like breath waiting to be released. Back at her small house at the edge of town, Eleanor lit every lamp she had. The place looked too ordinary under the bright glow of electricity. Too clean, too alive. She placed the letter back on her kitchen table and stared at it. She'd folded it neatly before she left. Now the fold looked smudged, like it had been handled again. Her pulse ticked at her throat. She reached for it, unfolding the paper slowly. A new line had been added beneath the first. Not everything that rests stays resting. She dropped it as if burned. The knock on the door came 3 seconds later. 3 slow taps. Not rushed. Not uncertain. She hesitated. Looked at the clock. It was just past midnight. Another knock. Still slow. Still waiting. She opened the drawer beside her and pulled out the small brass key that fit the antique box on the shelf above her fireplace. The box had belonged to her mother, who had whispered once, in one of her fevered final days, "This town keeps its secrets locked tight. Don't let them out." Eleanor had never opened it, but now it seemed the only thing left to do. Inside was a faded photograph, brittle with age. Her father stood beside 2 other men, none of whom she recognized. Behind them, the crooked oak from the cemetery loomed tall. And then she noticed, in the far corner of the photo, almost faded into nothing, a 4th figure. Barely visible. A blur, but looking straight at the camera. She didn't have time to examine it closer. The front door creaked open on its own. Not a gust of wind. Not a forgotten lock. It simply opened, and standing there was a man. Not her father, Not anyone from town. He was young, too young to look so worn. His clothes were old-fashioned, suspenders over a linen shirt, mud-caked boots. His eyes were hollow in a way that made her think of basements and dried-out wells. He didn't step inside, just stood there watching her. Then he raised one hand and pointed behind her. She turned. The photograph had changed. Now all 4 men were staring directly at her, and the 4th figure, the blurred one, was no longer blurred. It was the man at the door. Eleanor didn't scream. It wasn't fear that filled her, it was something colder. A slow, creeping realization that something had unraveled in her world, and there was no stitching it back the way it was. The man at the door remained still, as though he had all the time in the world. His hand was no longer pointing. It rested now at his side, loose as if the message had been delivered. She glanced again at the photo. The 4th figure, the man, was no longer just looking at the camera. His hand in the image was also raised, pointed directly toward the same direction as the real man had. This was no trick of light, no accident of time. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice dry. The man tilted his head as though the question puzzled him. Then, slowly, he stepped back into the night. The door stayed open. Eleanor crossed the room carefully and shut it, pressing the lock down with a deliberate click. She leaned her forehead against the wood. Her breath fogged the surface. This wasn't over. She didn't sleep. Instead, she sat at the table with the letter, the photo, and the brass key laid out like pieces to a puzzle with no edges. At dawn, she walked into town. The local library had stopped updating its newspaper archives 10 years ago, but they still kept the old microfilm records in a back room. Eleanor hadn't been in here since high school. It still smelled like paper and lemon oil. She scanned for names. Her father's obituary came up easily. Martin Hartley, 57, survived by his daughter, Eleanor. Standard fare. But then, in the weeks following his death, she found something else. A news clipping about an incident at the graveyard. Vandalism suspected in cemetery disturbance. No arrests. Just speculation. The report mentioned 3 headstones knocked over. A deep gouge in the earth. No signs of animals. No witnesses. She wrote the names down. One stood out. Jesse Nolan. The name meant nothing to her, but the obituary was brief. Died at 24. Buried in the north quadrant of the graveyard. No known family. But when she checked the town's old registry, she found something curious. Jesse Nolan had once lived 2 houses down from her childhood home. Same street. Same year her father had come back from his final deployment overseas. Her mind began stitching threads. Slowly, carefully. When she left the library, the sun had warmed the sidewalks. People were walking dogs, sipping coffee, laughing about things she no longer had space for in her thoughts. She returned to the cemetery. Not to her father's grave this time, but to the north quadrant. It took her a while to find it. The headstone was smaller than the others, tilted, as if the earth no longer wanted to hold it up. Jesse Nolan, 1908 to 1932. He kept his silence. A strange epitaph. Not loving, not grieving, just resigned. She kneeled in front of it, brushing away a tangle of grass that had grown across the letters. And there, at the base of the stone, lay something that hadn't been there long. A fresh coin. A silver dollar. She picked it up. It was warm. Too warm. Behind her, leaves rustled. She turned. Nothing. But as she looked back at the grave, her heart skipped. The name had changed. It still read Jesse Nolan, but beneath it, a new line had appeared. She's beginning to remember. Eleanor stood quickly. This wasn't just about her father. This was something he had been part of. Something he hadn't spoken of. Something he had buried, perhaps more literally than she wanted to believe. As she left the graveyard, the wind picked up for the first time that day, and faintly carried on it a whisper she couldn't quite catch. But she knew it was her name. The coin wouldn't stop burning in her hand. Eleanor dropped it into her coat pocket and clenched her fist, as if the pressure might push the heat away. But it wasn't the kind of warmth that came from metal in the sun. It felt alive, like it pulsed with a memory too stubborn to die. She returned home through back streets, avoiding the busier roads. Her senses felt raw, stretched thin, like skin over bone. Every sound seemed sharper, the hum of a far-off lawn mower, the bark of a dog behind a fence, the rhythmic knock of a wind chime. When she reached her porch, she stopped. There was something on the welcome mat. Another letter. Same paper. Same rushed handwriting. She didn't open it right away. Instead, she stepped inside, shut the door, and turned every lock. The letter lay in her lap for a while, untouched, as she stared at it, knowing whatever was inside would change things further. As if there was anything left that still felt solid. When she unfolded it, just 3 words stared back at her. The ledger waits. That was it. No explanation. No name. No signature. But she had heard that phrase before once, long ago. She was just a child, hiding under the table while her father argued with 2 men in the kitchen. One of them had slammed his fist down and hissed through his teeth, "The ledger waits, Martin. You can't just walk away." She remembered that moment because afterward, her father had sat down beside her on the floor, eyes hollow, and said softly, "Some debts, they're not paid with money." Eleanor stood slowly and crossed the room to the old coat closet. At the very back, behind a stack of boxes and faded umbrellas, was a wooden crate. She hadn't opened it in years. It was filled with her father's things, military badges, a compass, letters from people she never met, and a small leather notebook. It wasn't labeled, just a plain black cover, cracked along the spine. She opened it gently. The first page was filled with names, columns of them, some crossed out, some underlined, some circled twice in red ink. No explanations, just names and dates. The earliest was from 1911, the most recent 1974. She flipped ahead. More names, pages and pages of them. Then, halfway through, she saw one that made her blood chill. Jesse Nolan, 1932. Debt settled. She turned to the next page. Her father's name was there. Martin Hartley, 2004. Debt pending. And beneath it, her name, Eleanor Hartley. No date. No notes. Just the dash. Like her story hadn't been written yet. Or like someone was still deciding how it would end. She slammed the notebook shut and stepped back, nearly knocking over a lamp. Her chest ached, not with fear, exactly, but with a hollow knowing. Whatever her father had been involved in, It wasn't just military. It wasn't just trauma. It was something older, and somehow she had been born into it. Outside, the wind picked up suddenly, rattling the windows. The photo on the mantel fell face down to the floor. Eleanor walked over and turned it back up. It was the one of her and her father at the town picnic, smiling with paper cups in their hands. But now, behind them in the photo, another figure had appeared. The man from the doorway, and his hand rested lightly on her shoulder. Eleanor didn't sleep that night, though she lay in bed with the lights off, eyes wide, tracing the cracks in the ceiling like they might spell out a reason for all of this. The photograph sat on her nightstand. She had studied it for hours, turning it, tilting it under the light. But no matter the angle, the figure remained. A man whose hand rested on her shoulder like a claim. His expression unreadable. Not smiling, not frowning, just watching. She had tried burning the picture, taken it to the sink, lit a match, but the flame curled, recoiled, and went out. Twice. Whatever had begun, it wasn't done with her. By morning, the town felt different, as if something had tilted beneath it in the night. People walked the same streets, but slower, glancing up at the sky more often. Birds flew low, unsettled. Eleanor walked to the only person she could think of who might know something, Maeve Turnley. Maeve had been the town's unofficial historian for years. Lived in a green house with chimes made of spoons and bones. People called her strange, but Eleanor's father used to say, "Maeve knows what's buried around here, literally and otherwise." Maeve opened the door before Eleanor knocked. "I was wondering when you'd come," she said, stepping aside. Inside, the house was dim, filled with the scent of dried herbs and something faintly metallic. Books lined the shelves in no particular order. Eleanor didn't speak right away, just held out the notebook and the photograph. Maeve took them in her delicate hands, nodding slightly. "Ledger still active, then? You know what this is?" Eleanor asked. Maeve sank into a chair, motioning for Eleanor to do the same. "The ledger is older than this town. Older than most names written in it. Your father tried to end it. Others before him tried too. It doesn't end. Not like that. What is it?" Maeve ran a finger down the notebook's spine. "A record of debts. Promises made and not kept. Agreements sealed in quiet corners. Some with blood. Some with silence. My father, he was part of it." Reluctantly, Maeve said. "He inherited the debt from someone else, just as you've now inherited his." Eleanor's breath caught. "I didn't agree to anything." "You were born into it," Maeve said gently. "That's enough." They sat in silence for a moment, the ticking of a crooked wall clock the only sound. "There's a ritual," Maeve said slowly. "Not to break it, but to understand your place in it. At the edge of the cemetery, just before the woods begin, there's an old well. Covered now, but still there." Eleanor nodded. She remembered it. Kids used to dare each other to throw rocks at the stones around it. No one ever got too close. "You go there at night," Maeve said, "and you listen. That's all. You don't speak. You don't run. You listen. If you're lucky, the well will tell you how it started. That's the only way to know how to continue." Eleanor left Maeve's house with a small cloth pouch filled with something that smelled of rosemary and rain. "To keep you whole," Maeve had said. Not safe, just whole. The sky was already dimming as she returned home. Time seemed to move strangely now, skipping like a record with a hidden scratch. At midnight she walked to the well. The grass was high, wet with dew. The stones around the well had cracked, some fallen in. A heavy wooden lid covered the mouth, nailed shut with rusted spikes. She sat beside it, waited. Nothing happened for a long time. Then the wind died, completely, and from deep within the well, something began to speak. Not in words, not exactly, but in memories that were not hers, images, sounds, names. A blood oath beneath a moonless sky, a name whispered into dying breath, a ledger written not with ink but with shadow, and always, always the phrase, "What is taken must be paid." Eleanor sat still, letting it wash through her, shivering though the night was warm. When the voices faded, she opened her eyes, and carved into the wood of the well's lid, which had been smooth before, were the words, "Your page is next." The walk home from the well felt longer than the journey there. Eleanor moved as though her body no longer fit quite right, like something had shifted beneath her skin. The night pressed close, heavy with silence. Even the insects had gone quiet. She didn't light the lamps when she got home. The darkness didn't feel threatening anymore, it felt honest. Safer than what she might see in the light. The notebook lay where she'd left it, next to the unopened box of her father's old letters. She picked it up, flipped to her name again. Still there, still blank beneath it. Her page was next. She sat at the kitchen table, her fingers tracing the cracks in the leather cover. The memories the well had given her were still tangled in her mind, faces she didn't know, places she'd never been, but emotions so strong they pulsed through her veins like her own heartbeat. What is taken must be paid. She didn't know yet what had been taken, but she had a feeling the payment wouldn't be something simple. The next morning, a knock at the door startled her. She hadn't expected anyone, not after last night. When she opened it, a woman stood there, mid-30s, eyes sharp, suitcase in hand. "You're Eleanor Hartley?" "Yes." "I'm Nora. I think we're cousins." "Maybe." Eleanor blinked. "I don't." Nora nodded toward the house. "Mind if I come in? I have something you should see." Inside, Nora placed her suitcase on the floor and pulled out an old envelope, yellowed and sealed with wax. It had a name written across the front in ink that had faded to brown. "To the final bearer of the Hartley debt." "I found it after my grandmother passed," Nora said. "She used to talk about our family like we came from a line of watchmen. That we weren't protectors, we were containers. Of things too old to fight." Eleanor's throat tightened. "I've never heard of you. No reason you would have. Our side left this town decades ago. But the name pulls people back. That ledger, it doesn't stay buried." They sat across from each other at the table, and Eleanor finally broke the seal. Inside were pages of handwritten notes, descriptions of rituals, names, instructions, and one phrase repeated over and over: "The shadow does not forget." The final page was a map, a crude sketch of the graveyard, but with a section marked that Eleanor had never seen before. A place behind the trees, labeled only the hollow ground. "What is this?" Eleanor asked, voice low. "Where it began," Nora said, "and maybe where it can end." Eleanor stared at the map, the lines starting to shift in her mind. The ground behind the graveyard, she remembered it vaguely from childhood. A place the grown-ups told her not to go. Not because it was dangerous, but because there's nothing there, which she now realized was a warning in disguise. Nothing there, nothing visible. Nora reached into her coat and handed her another item. A key, ornate, old, heavy in the hand. I think it opens something in that place. I don't know what, but I think it's for you. Eleanor closed her hand around it. She could feel the story pulling tighter around her, like the loop of a thread being drawn through fabric, cinching toward some inevitable knot. The sun dipped low again outside. Another day gone, slipping into the dark without resistance. Eleanor folded the map carefully and placed it in her coat pocket. She didn't know yet what the hollow ground would reveal, but she was ready to find out. Eleanor and Nora stood at the edge of the woods as twilight deepened, the trees casting long, reaching shadows across the field. The map crinkled softly in Eleanor's hand, its lines more alive now than they'd been under lamplight. They weren't just ink anymore, they were memory, made physical. Behind them, the last headstones of the graveyard leaned toward the trees like spectators too weary to stand upright. "You're sure this is it?" Nora asked. Eleanor nodded. "I think I've always known. I just didn't understand what I was remembering." Together, they stepped into the woods. It wasn't far no more than a 10-minute walk, but the silence grew thicker with each step. Even the usual rustle of leaves felt muted, as if the forest had taken a long, slow breath and held it. The hollow ground wasn't a clearing. It wasn't a cave. It was just a dip in the earth, circular, lined with moss-covered stones. Some had been placed deliberately, forming a wide ring. At the center, a flat stone slab sat half-sunken into the soil, and at its base, a keyhole. The iron was so old it had turned green in places, and yet it still shone faintly, as if something beneath the surface gave off its own light. Eleanor stepped forward and took the key from her coat. It felt colder than it had in the house. Heavier, too. "Before you do that," Nora said gently, "there's something you should know." Eleanor turned. "My grandmother, she wasn't just part of the family line. She was part of the binding. The ledger wasn't just a record, it was a lock. Your father was the last to hold the key, but he refused to turn it." Eleanor swallowed. "Because of me? Maybe. Or maybe because he knew once it opened, nothing would stay the same." Eleanor looked down at the keyhole. The ledger had never been just a book. It was a symbol, a contract. And contracts could be broken, but only by those who understood what they were truly signing. She crouched and pushed the key into the slot. It fit too perfectly, like it had been waiting. As she turned it, the ground shivered. Not a quake more, like an exhale, deep and slow. The slab of stone shifted slightly, revealing a hollow space beneath. No ladder, just depth. Eleanor leaned in. Cool air rose from the opening, tinged with something ancient like rainwater soaked through time. Then the voice returned. Not a whisper, not a threat, just words spoken quietly with the weight of centuries behind them. "You seek to balance what was borrowed. You offer remembrance for what was taken. Step forward." She looked at Nora, who nodded once. This part is yours." Eleanor lowered herself down. The air cooled her skin like she was sinking into a deep pool. The passage was narrower than she expected, but walkable. As she moved forward, the space lit faintly on its own pale patterns, glowing along the walls, pulsing softly with her breath. Then she saw them. Names, etched into the stone. Not just Hartley's hundreds of surnames, some old, some recent, some she recognized from the town's past. The banker who vanished in 1937. The school teacher who was never found. Her mother's maiden name. And then at the very end of the passage, her own. Eleanor Hartley. She reached out and touched it. Immediately, the stone beneath her feet warmed, and a flood of memory not hers rushed through her. A boy making a promise by candlelight. A soldier breaking an oath in desperation. A mother offering silence in exchange for safety. All debts, all anchored here. She stepped back. The name beneath hers was still blank, but slowly letters began to carve themselves into the stone. Nora Elsbeth Turnley. Eleanor turned. Nora had followed her in, her eyes wide but steady. "The ledger chose us both," she said. And then the light dimmed. Not into darkness, but into calm. The wall before them shimmered slightly. And then the final inscription appeared. "Let what was hidden be held. Let what was borrowed be known." The weight that had pressed against Eleanor's chest for days lifted. Not vanished, but shared. As they climbed out together, the air above was lighter. The trees no longer leaned in. The moss-covered stones no longer watched. And behind them, the stone lid slid closed with a quiet final click. The sun was just beginning to rise as Eleanor and Nora emerged from the woods, their coats damp with dew and something else, something older, less natural. The world looked the same, but felt different, like they had crossed back into it from a place that didn't play by its rules. The graveyard behind them lay still under the soft light. No movement, no mist, just rows of crooked headstones, quiet and watching. They said nothing as they walked the winding path back to Eleanor's home. There was too much to say, and none of it would sound quite right under morning skies. Inside, Eleanor poured 2 cups of tea. Her hands were steady now, the tremble from the night before finally settled. She passed one to Nora, who took it with a tired nod. "You saw it too?" Eleanor asked after a long moment. Nora didn't look up. "I saw enough." They sipped in silence. The clock ticked. The house breathed. Then Eleanor stood and crossed to the shelf where the old ledger still lay. She opened it again, slowly, reverently, as though it could still bite. The names were unchanged. Her father's entry still marked debt pending. Hers still a dash. But at the very back of the book, a new page had appeared. Blank, except for the title. Witnesses. Beneath it, 2 names had been written in careful ink. Eleanor Hartley. Nora Turnley. Eleanor stared at it. The ledger was evolving. "What does it mean?" Nora asked quietly. "I think it means we're no longer part of the debt," Eleanor said slowly. "We're part of the remembering." Nora tilted her head. "So what now?" Eleanor closed the book. "We don't pay the debt. We carry the story." Nora nodded, a small smile flickering at the corner of her mouth. "Feels lighter than I expected." Eleanor didn't answer. She moved to the mantel and lifted the photograph again, the one that had changed. The man who had rested his hand on her shoulder was still there, but his eyes were softer now, no longer hollow, almost at peace. She traced the edge of the frame with her thumb. "He was warning me," she whispered. "Not haunting." Nora stood beside her. "Your father?" Eleanor nodded. "I think he wanted me to find it, to finish what he couldn't." They stood there, side by side, as the light grew brighter through the windows. For the first time in days, the house felt like a house, not a threshold. Later that afternoon, Eleanor returned to Maeve's house. The old woman opened the door with a knowing look. "I felt it," she said before Eleanor could speak. Something shifted. Eleanor handed her the ledger. "It's no longer just a book of names." Maeve took it reverently. "No, now it's a map." Eleanor nodded. "A map of what was forgotten, what still waits in silence." Maeve smiled. "And silence is sacred." As Eleanor walked back through town, she noticed little things. A man repainting the shutters of his shop. A girl skipping down the sidewalk with her shoes untied. A dog barking from a porch and wagging its tail. The world hadn't changed, but something under it had. That night, Eleanor dreamed of the well, but not as a place of darkness. It was full of water now, still and clear, a mirror to the sky, and at its bottom something rested. Not a curse, not a secret, a seed, waiting. Days passed without incident. The hush that had haunted Eleanor's every step was gone, replaced by a strange calm, not silence, but a quiet full of meaning, like the pause between breaths. She spent much of her time tending to small things, clearing out her father's old drawer of loose screws and forgotten receipts, mending a rip in the hem of a coat she hadn't worn in years, watering the dusty plant in the corner of the living room that she used to forget even existed. The house had begun to feel like hers again, but not because the presence had left, because it had settled. One evening, Nora came by with a box tucked beneath her arm. She didn't explain, just set it gently on the table between them and opened the flaps. Inside were items Eleanor didn't recognize. Old photographs, small objects, buttons, pens, charms, each wrapped in thin cloth or tucked into envelopes. Nora unfolded a paper and handed it over. It was a page from another ledger. "You have one too?" Eleanor asked. Nora nodded. Not as full, not as detailed, but similar. "My grandmother kept it hidden for years. I didn't realize what it was until I saw yours." Eleanor studied the objects in the box. Some were labeled, others were not. But one caught her eye, a carved wooden token, worn smooth on the edges. On one side was a name, Louisa Whitmore, and on the back she waited at the hollow. "She was my grandmother's sister," Nora said softly. "Disappeared when she was 17. They never found her. Until recently, I didn't even know she'd been part of all this." Eleanor turned the token in her hand. It felt faintly warm, like the coin had. "So many people," she whispered. Nora nodded. All of them held something, carried something. Most never knew what. Some vanished. Some stayed. They spread the contents of the box across the table. With the two ledgers beside them, patterns began to emerge. Names repeated. Symbols appeared in the margins, circles drawn around dates that aligned with strange events the town never talked about. A storm in 1932 that had uprooted graves. A fire in 1957 that spared only the oldest buildings. A night in 1974 when the clocks in town all stopped for 9 minutes at midnight. None of it random. Eleanor leaned back, her mind stitching together what the ancestors had only hinted at. These weren't just happenings, she said. They were signals. Nora's eyes widened. Signals to what? I don't know yet, Eleanor admitted. But they're not done. Whatever this is, it's still unfolding, still choosing. She stood and crossed to the old fireplace. For the first time in years, she lit it. The flame flickered uncertainly, then steadied. Above it hung the photograph, the one that had changed. Now a fifth figure had appeared. Faint, barely there, but present. A child. Standing just behind Eleanor. She turned toward Nora, heart suddenly still. I think it's marking the next bearer. Nora followed her gaze. You don't have children. Eleanor nodded. Not yet. Silence settled between them. Not fear, not regret, just knowing. She touched the photo gently, as if it might shatter. I don't think the debt ends, she said. No, Nora agreed. But maybe it's not a curse. Eleanor looked down at the ledgers, at the boxes of tokens and forgotten names. Maybe, she whispered, it's a trust. And then the fire in the hearth flared just for a moment, as if something had heard. The days grew longer, and with them, the quiet weight of the ledger seemed to settle deeper into Eleanor's life. It was no longer just a mystery to solve or a burden to bear. It had become a part of her rhythm, woven into the very air she breathed. She spent mornings at the town's small cafe, listening to stories exchanged over coffee and soft laughter. Evenings found her at the graveyard's edge, where she'd learned to sit without fear, letting the night unfold gently around her. Nora was her steady companion through it all, bringing letters, artifacts, and quiet encouragement. Their shared discovery created a fragile bond, one that felt both new and ancient at once. One afternoon, Eleanor noticed a flyer pinned to the community board near the library. It was faded, torn at the edges, a notice from decades ago, announcing a gathering for the descendants of the town's founding families. The date was circled in faded ink, October 31st. Something stirred inside her, a pull that felt both familiar and urgent. She mentioned it to Nora, who frowned thoughtfully. Maybe that's why your grandmother left the ledger behind, Nora mused. To remind you about the gathering. To prepare you. Eleanor nodded slowly, feeling the threads pull tighter. On the evening of October 31st, the town buzzed with a quiet energy. Lights flickered in windows, and children dressed as ghosts and witches ran through the streets with laughter. But beneath the surface, something else hummed a current of remembrance. Eleanor and Nora approached the town hall, where an older woman waited by the door, handing out small candles to those who arrived. Inside, the room was dim, filled with the scent of burning sage and old wood. The faces around her were both strangers and echoes of the past. Names she'd read in the ledger were spoken aloud, stories retold in whispers and smiles. The woman who had greeted them introduced herself as Mrs. Calhoun, a guardian of memories and stories long held close. She spoke softly, her voice carrying the weight of generations. We gather tonight not to pay debts, but to honor them, to remember those who came before us and those who will come after. One by one, attendees lit their candles, the soft glow filling the room like a gentle sea. Eleanor felt her heart open, the burden she'd carried shifting into something lighter connection. Mrs. Calhoun handed her a small book, its cover embossed with symbols matching those in the ledger. "This is for you," she said, "to add your story and to keep the light passing." Eleanor took it reverently. As the night deepened, the gathering moved outside to the graveyard. Candles flickered along the paths, illuminating the stones and trees with a soft golden light. She stood beside Nora near the hollow ground, feeling the warmth of the flames and the cool night air mingling. A breeze whispered through the leaves, carrying voices soft, distant, and full of memories. Eleanor closed her eyes. For the first time, she felt not alone. She felt part of something greater. The ledger was no longer a chain, but a thread in the tapestry of the town's soul. And as the candles burned low, she knew the story would continue not as a burden, but as a gift passed gently from hand to hand. The day has done all it needs to do. Now only stillness remains. Let your thoughts loosen like threads unraveling in the dark. What comes next is not to solve or to chase, just a quiet story drifting close. Perhaps it's a voice that remembers you, or a silence that has waited patiently. Let it meet you where you are, and let it lead you gently into rest. Eleanor sat by the window, the fading light casting soft shadows across the room. The ledgers lay closed on the table, the stories they held now part of her, woven into the fabric of her life. Outside, the graveyard stood silent beneath the moon, the hollow ground resting quietly, its secrets held in waiting. She thought of the man in the photograph, his hand resting gently on her shoulder, a reminder not of fear, but of connection. The debts had not vanished, but the weight had changed. It was no longer a burden to carry alone, but a legacy to honor, a story to pass on with care and kindness. Not all spirits seek to frighten. Some just wish to be remembered. If their tale lingered with you, let it rest with your breath. Sleep well tonight. And if you hear a whisper in your dreams, maybe it's just the end of the story. The night deepened, folding the world into its quiet embrace. Eleanor remained by the window, the silver light of the moon casting gentle patterns on the floorboards. The house breathed softly around her, the familiar creaks and sighs of age, the whisper of wind through the trees outside. It was a stillness unlike any she had known before, one filled with presence rather than absence. She thought again of the man from the photograph, the shadow who had rested his hand lightly on her shoulder. His gaze, once hollow, now seemed suffused with a quiet peace. Not a warning, not a ghost's lament, but something softer, a connection that transcended time and memory. The ledgers, their names and debts, the silent promises written in ink and shadow felt, less like chains and more like threads in a vast tapestry. Threads that tied together the lives of those who had come before and those who would follow. Eleanor felt the weight of that legacy in a new way, not as a burden to bear alone, but as a shared story to carry with care and compassion. Her thoughts drifted back to the hollow ground, the hidden place beneath the earth, where the ledger was more than just a book. It was a wellspring of memory, of loss and love intertwined. A place where the past met the present and where the living could touch the stories of the forgotten. She imagined the countless souls who had walked that path before her, those who had carried debts, not only of money or promise, but of silence and remembrance. The boy making a candle-lit vow, the soldier breaking an oath, the mother offering quiet protection. Each one woven into the fabric of this town, their stories folded into the very soil beneath her feet. And she saw herself as part of that ongoing story, neither the beginning nor the end, but a link in a chain that stretched across generations. A keeper of memories, a guardian of secrets, a bearer of light in the darkness. Outside, the wind stirred gently, rustling leaves and carrying a faint, almost imperceptible whisper. It was a voice she could not yet understand, a murmur of stories still waiting to be told. But Eleanor was ready. She rose from her chair and walked to the mantel where the photograph stood. She reached out and touched the frame, feeling the warmth that lingered there, a warmth not of fire or flame, but of something enduring and true. The house felt alive with possibility, a sanctuary for those stories yet to come. And as the first light of dawn began to edge the horizon, Eleanor knew that the ledger's story was far from over. It was only beginning. Morning light spilled gently into Eleanor's room, casting soft shadows across the walls that seemed to dance like old memories waking from a long sleep. She sat quietly at her desk, the ledger open before her, a silent invitation to continue the journey she had inherited. The previous night's reflections lingered, weaving through her thoughts like a gentle current. The ledger was no longer just a record of debts and names. It had become a living testament to the resilience of those who had come before, and the hope carried forward by those still to come. Eleanor carefully began to write, her pen moving slowly across the pages. She recorded stories she had uncovered, moments of kindness hidden beneath the weight of obligation, and the small acts of courage that had shaped her family's history. With each word, the ledger seemed to glow softly, as if acknowledging the importance of being seen and heard. Later, Nora arrived with news that stirred a quiet excitement between them. A distant relative had contacted her, a historian specializing in the forgotten histories of their region. She was interested in collaborating, piecing together the scattered fragments of their intertwined pasts. The two women sat together, planning ways to uncover more truths buried beneath layers of time and silence. They spoke of archives, interviews with older townsfolk, and even possibilities of mapping the ledger's reach beyond their small town. Eleanor felt a renewed sense of purpose. The burden she had once feared was transforming into a bridge, a connection between past, present, and future. As the days turned into weeks, the story grew richer, deeper, threaded with voices that had long been muted. Each discovery brought a gentle reminder. The ledger was more than a list of debts. It was a chronicle of lives lived, sacrifices made, and love that endured beyond the veil of forgetting. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Eleanor stood once more at the edge of the graveyard. The air was cool, filled with the scent of earth and pine. The hollow ground lay quiet, the stones bathed in fading light. She felt the presence there, not as a shadow to fear, but as a reminder to honor. Her fingers brushed the pendant. She now wore a small wooden token from Nora's family, carved smooth by time and touch. A symbol of their shared journey. Eleanor whispered a silent vow to the night, to carry the stories with care, to be the light in the dark, to let remembrance be a gift rather than a chain. And as stars began to sprinkle the sky, she felt the ledger settle within her, a steady heartbeat in the quiet night. The story would continue, but this time on her own terms. The months that followed unfolded like the turning of a well-worn page, each day adding layers to the story Eleanor now understood as hers to tell. She and Nora worked tirelessly, piecing together fragments of their family's histories and the town's secrets. They visited elders, explored forgotten archives, and mapped the ripple of names that stretched far beyond the graveyard's edge. The ledger had become a living map of connection, a testament to the endurance of memory across time and circumstance. And with each new discovery, Eleanor felt the weight of the past lesson replaced by a quiet strength. One crisp autumn afternoon, Eleanor found herself at the local library, thumbing through an old newspaper archive. A headline caught her eye: "Mysterious Disappearance at Hollow Ground, 1924. Her breath caught. She read on a young woman vanished without a trace, leaving behind whispers and unanswered questions. She felt the ledger pulse gently in her bag. Later, as she shared the story with Nora, they realized the woman was connected to the ledger a keeper before them, whose story had been lost in the shadows. It became clear that the ledger was not just about debts owed or repaid, but about those who had carried the quiet burden of remembrance, who had stood watch when others could not. Eleanor looked out across the town from her window, feeling a deep sense of belonging and purpose. The shadow in the moonlit graveyard was no longer a presence to fear, but a reminder of resilience, connection, and the enduring power of stories told with care. She knew the journey was far from over, but now it was hers to guide, with gentle hands and an open heart. And as the moon rose high above the quiet town, Eleanor felt the story settle softly around her, like a familiar lullaby. Eleanor's nights were no longer haunted by shadows or whispers, but filled with quiet reflections and a growing sense of peace. The ledger, once a symbol of mystery and burden, had become a vessel of understanding, a reminder that every story, no matter how old, was worth telling and honoring. She and Nora continued their work, not just as keepers of the ledger, but as storytellers for a community bound by memory and grace. Their shared journey had forged a bond that reached beyond family, beyond time. One evening, as autumn leaves danced in the breeze, Eleanor received a letter. The handwriting was unfamiliar but elegant, the paper thick and scented faintly with lavender. It read simply, "Thank you for remembering. The story lives because you chose to listen." There was no signature, only a small symbol, a delicate crescent moon intertwined with a blooming flower. Eleanor smiled softly, folding the letter carefully. She knew then that the ledger's story was not hers alone to carry. It was a gift passed through hands and hearts willing to hold it gently. And with that knowledge, she felt the quiet strength of those who had come before and those who would come after. Outside, the moon cast its silver light over the graveyard, peaceful and still. The shadow was gone, but the story, always the story, remained. Weeks turned into months, and the seasons shifted with their usual gentle rhythm. Eleanor found herself becoming a quiet pillar within the town, a keeper not only of the ledger, but of the stories and memories that wove the community together. Her work with Nora blossomed into something deeper than either could have imagined. They hosted gatherings, inviting townsfolk to share stories passed down through families, to remember those who had been forgotten and to celebrate the resilience that bound them all. These evenings were filled with warmth and laughter, tears and quiet moments of remembrance. The ledger was no longer a secret burden, but a shared treasure, a living archive of the town's soul. One particularly crisp evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky in shades of amber and rose, Eleanor stood before a circle of neighbors and friends. The soft glow of lanterns illuminated faces young and old. She spoke softly, her voice steady and sure. We all carry stories, some heavy, some light, but it is in sharing them that we find connection and healing. The ledger reminds us that no story is ever truly lost, and that remembrance is a gift we give one another. Her words settled over the group like a gentle embrace, weaving a sense of unity and peace. Afterward, as the last lantern flickered out, Eleanor walked home beneath a sky scattered with stars. The cool night air carried the scent of earth and wood smoke, a reminder of home. She paused at the edge of the graveyard, gazing toward the hollow ground, now quiet and still under the moon's watchful eye. A smile touched her lips. The shadow that had once loomed had transformed into a beacon, an enduring light guiding her forward. And as she turned to walk back, Eleanor knew that the story would continue, carried not just by her, but by everyone who chose to remember. Eleanor's days grew quieter, but her heart remained full with the knowledge that the ledger's story was now woven into the fabric of the town's life. The gatherings she and Nora hosted became a cherished tradition, drawing neighbors who sought to connect with their past and one another. The hollow ground, once a place shrouded in mystery and silence, transformed into a sacred space for remembrance and renewal. Children played nearby, their laughter a joyful counterpoint to the solemn stories shared beneath the stars. One evening, as the wind carried the scent of pine and damp earth, Eleanor found herself alone at the edge of the graveyard. The moon was full and bright, casting silver light over the stones and trees. She closed her eyes, breathing deeply, feeling the pulse of the land beneath her feet. In that stillness she heard not a shadow but a song, a melody of lives lived, lessons learned and love passed from one generation to the next. Opening her eyes, she reached into her pocket and touched the wooden token Nora had given her. It was smooth and warm, a tangible connection to the past, and a promise for the future. The ledger, the well, the hollow ground, all were threads in a tapestry far larger than any one person. Eleanor smiled softly, knowing that whatever lay ahead, she was part of a story that stretched beyond time, carried forward by those who dared to listen and remember. And with the moon watching over her, she stepped forward, ready for whatever the next chapter might bring.